For as long as I could remember, I never saw my parents at night. I never got a bedtime story or even a simple goodnight kiss from them. Don't get me wrong, they weren't bad parents and they loved me dearly, but I always sensed they were kind of off, to say the least. Growing up as an only child, I mostly played by myself or basically begged my parents to play with me. I didn't have any friends or get any human interaction since I was homeschooled, and we barely left the house in general. We basically lived in isolation. Our nearest neighbors were about 30 minutes away from us. Even till this day, I don't know how my parents were able to afford the nice house that we live in. As I grew up, my parents made sure to drill this one rule into my head. Never open this door after 8:30. No matter what, this door stays locked and closed. My parents were very strict about this rule, especially my father, as my mother was much more lenient with me when it came down to it. One incident I still remember clear as day. I was about 9 or 10 at the time. I was with my parents watching some dumb children's movie. As 8:30 rolled around, I was sent to my room, and right before I locked my door, I heard light thumps on the wall. I didn't think much of it, as the house would randomly make noises like that. After some time, I tried to fall asleep, but I found it hard. Tossing and turning around in my bed wasn't helping me either, as I laid in silence. Light scraping and muffled noises echoed out into the somewhat quiet house. Sitting up in my bed, I sat there for what felt like eternity. I gathered enough courage. While walking toward my door, all the scraping and muffled noises suddenly stopped. As I got to my door, I placed my hand on the lock and slowly unlocked it. I pushed it open. My nostrils were hit with a gut-wrenching smell I could only describe as stinky at the time. My eyes started to adjust to the darkened hallway. I stepped out into the hallway, but before I could walk further, I bumped into something soft but firm. I slowly looked up, and looking back at me was my mother. But it wasn't her. Her skin was ghost white, and it looked like she was a rotting corpse. Her face had a long black gash running down to her chest area, and her hands didn't seem normal either. She held her arm. She held it so tight, blood started rolling down. But whatever she was bleeding wasn't blood. It was black, almost like ink. Her clothes had big red splatters on the front of it, and her hair looked dead and dried out. Her skin looked off, like it was a costume of some sort. As I looked back up at her, her facial expression changed drastically. It was like she was restraining herself from doing something. As I tried making up an excuse, she finally spoke. "Bed. Now." Her voice sounded all twisted and distorted. It sent chills down my spine, as she never did that before. I walked back to my room, and as she slammed the door, I could vividly remember sounds of tearing and quick footsteps running down the hallway. I've tried confronting my parents about this multiple times since then, but they always brushed it off as me having a nightmare or just completely changing the subject. Even after I reached into my teen years, I always thought it was just a surreal nightmare I had. Boy, was I wrong. I thought since I was getting older, my parents would give me a bit more freedom and let me stay out of my room for a while longer. To say they were even more strict than before would be an understatement. Ever since the little hallway nightmare, my parents rearranged my lock so that it would only lock from the outside. At the time, I didn't have a problem with it since I was only a child. But as I grew into my teenage years, I found it weird and a bit creepy. They were so bent on locking me in my room at night. Last week, I was out in the kitchen finishing up some last-minute book report I was assigned. My father slammed my laptop closed, almost hitting my fingers in the process. "Don't you see what time it is?" His voice was stern and firm as his presence shook me a little. As I turned around toward the living room clock, I silently read out the time to myself. 8:35? I slowly turned back toward my father. As I looked up at his face, he had some As I looked up at his face, he had the same facial expression my mother had when she caught me sneaking out years before, like he was restraining himself from doing something. His body was moving on its own, like something was inside of his skin and trying to get out. But before I could inspect further, he pointed in the direction of my room with a stern manner. I made my way towards my room, and not even 6 seconds later, I heard locks clicking as multiple footsteps walked away. I tried sneaking out of my room, but it proved no good as I tried pulling the door rattles of a chain bumped against my door. As I sat in the dark, I made my way toward my drawer and slowly grabbed a pick lock I was saving. I never picked lock a door, so I stuck it in and moved it around for 5 or 10 minutes. As I was about to give up, I heard a small click and slowly opened the door, but was stopped by a small chain. As I started picking the chain lock, I could hear faint screaming and the same scraping I've been hearing for nearly half my life coming from the living room area. As the chain lock clicked, I carefully sat it down and stepped out into the hallway. Slowly making my way toward the living room, the screams became a bit clearer. I peeked around the corner, and as I did, nothing was there. The living room was empty and quiet. As I came around the corner, I noticed a bright red door that was never there before. I slowly got closer to the door, and a chill shot down my spine as the air got heavy and thick. More screams came from behind the door, and the combo of curiosity and being scared got to me. I slowly crouched down and raised my eye toward the small keyhole, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. It was my parents. They were standing around a silver table. There was red and black liquid splattered all over the place. As I scanned the room, the muffled screams started again. I looked back at the table and saw a pair of feet covered in red liquid struggling and wiggling around. As my mother walked in front of the table, something I can't forget happened. My mother placed her hands on her face and ripped it completely off. A bony, dark humanoid emerged from my mother's skin. The creature's arms were long and disoriented, and its hands were long and sharp. My father removed his skin and revealed a taller humanoid with bigger teeth and claws. The sounds of scraping were them torturing people. The screams kept going, and the person struggled as the sight of my parents remove their skin scared him more. The creature walked slowly toward the man and placed one of its dark, sharp claws over his mouth before stabbing him repeatedly. Being scared and confused, I stupidly backed up into a lamp, causing it to fall over and break. The thump stopped, and with quick thinking, I ran back toward my room. Foolishly, I turned around and saw one of those things slowly walking after me. As I got to my room, I slammed it shut and placed my dresser in front of it. A voice came from behind the door as scraping came from the other side. "Come out, honey. We aren't going to hurt you. We love you." A twisted tone came from the other side. As the scraping and banging continued, I came up with the best plan that I could think of. I grabbed a textbook from my bookshelf, and with all my might, I chucked it out the window. As the door began to move, I quickly hid under my bed. The door swung open with such force it bounced off the wall as they walked into the room with my heart pounding fast. "She can't escape here. She knows too much." As I heard them talking, I quickly moved from under the bed and ran toward the door. As they realized what had happened, I already slammed the door shut and locked them in. Without any hesitation, I ran. And I ran hard. Even when I bursted through the front door, I kept running. All I could hear was distant screams and my harsh breathing. I kept running towards the woods and didn't look back at my former home. After 4 minutes of running, I finally stopped to catch my breath. I could see my house from a distance, but I could make out 2 figures moving toward the woods. As I pushed myself to keep running, I could still hear faint screams from the house. As it started raining, the wind became strong and harsh. I couldn't do anything but sob. As I walked onto the road, I followed it for Lord knows how long. The cold rain hitting my skin as the sky grew darker. Sirens blared in the distance when it became quiet. The harsh winds blew through my hair as I shivered through the cold winds. As I was about to give up, I saw bright lights in the distance. A truck sign flashed bright as multiple trucks pulled in. A small relief came over me as I started running toward the truck stop. Tripping over myself multiple times, I kept running. I felt more and more relieved as I got closer. I'm finally free.